Hello, everyone. My name is Steve, and welcome back to American Steam Legacy. It's been said that all great things have humble beginnings, and this certainly applies to the Norfolk and Western Y Class, if an eight-coupled compound articulated can be considered humble. But in all honesty, the Y Class was a good idea that just got better over time. 40 years of continuous improvement and a little help from an unexpected source culminated in the most gangster of articulated power, the Y6B, a locomotive capable of producing so much power in simple mode that it threatened to unmanufacture itself. So we're going to take a look at the Norfolk and Western Y Class, coming up next on American Steam Legacy. The first decade of the 20th century was very good to the Norfolk and Western Railroad. Traffic on the system had grown substantially, and the consolidations used for heavy drag freight were reaching their limits. By 1910, the need to move vast tonnage had grown to the point where even double-headed consolidations were inadequate, and a need for a motive power upgrade was obvious. The Norfolk and Western had several options available. The 282 Mikado and the 210-2 Santa Fe's had been around for a while and had proven themselves as capable freight haulers. But the Norfolk and Western decided to buck some prevailing trends and take a go big or go home approach. Railroads of this time period were generally reluctant to adopt technology that they perceived as unproven. And when it came to articulated power, many roads preferred the tried and true Santa Fe, almost to the exclusion of the six and eight coupled compound articulateds. The Norfolk and Western saw the eight coupled compound as the solution to their problem. It was either a leap of faith or seeing potential where others couldn't that led the road to give the 0880 and the 2882 a try. The compound articulated first appeared on American rail 6 years earlier in 1904. The first full adhesion eight-coupled compound appeared in 1907, and the 2882 2 years later in 1909. So the eight-coupled compounds were very new concepts without much operational history upon which to base a decision. But rather than dip their toe in the water by testing one of each, the Norfolk and Western decided to take the full plunge by ordering 10. In May of 1910, the Norfolk and Western took delivery of 5 full-adhesion, 8-coupled compounds from Alco's Schenectady Works and 5 Baldwin-built 2882s. The Alco products would comprise the X1 class, and the Baldwins would become the Y1 class. Both classes shared the same vital statistics. Boiler pressure, driver diameter, tractive effort, and even the valve gear were the same, but there were substantial differences that would contribute to the longevity, or lack thereof, of both the X and Y1 class locomotives. To put it simply, the X1s were a portrait of simplicity, while the Y1s were very much otherwise. The X1's boiler was a straightforward steam generator with no performance-enhancing appliances like a superheater. However, Alco opted for the Mellon system of compounding. On starting, steam pressure in the cylinders on the front engine is basically zero, which means the rear engine is doing all the work until steam pressure builds up in the receiver pipe, carrying the rear engine's exhaust to the front engine. The Mellon system allows steam to flow to the front engine as soon as the throttle is opened. An automatic valve allows steam to flow into the receiver pipe until the pressure reaches approximately 100 to 110 pounds per square inch, at which point the automatic valve closes, leaving the locomotive operating entirely as a compound. The Mellon system didn't work on demand since there was no provision for controlling it from the cab. The Y1 was a different story. While the method of compounding operated on the same principle, the intercepting valve could be open or closed at the engineer's discretion. The boiler, on the other hand, was designed around a moderate superheat system Baldwin was tinkering with at the time. This was Baldwin's infamous separable boiler concept. The boiler was divided into 2 sections. The front section received water from the tender and served as a feed water heater. From there, the water was transmitted to the rear section to be turned into steam, which was then sent to the rear engine. The exhaust from the rear engine would take a quick detour through a reheater located in the smoke box before being sent forward to the low-pressure cylinders. During testing, the X1 proved to be the better performer, but the Norfolk and Western liked the Y1 for its better riding qualities. However, the X1 class would outlive the Y1s by nearly 10 years. After being fitted with a superheater and boiler pressure raised to 230 psi, the X1s would be used in hump service until being scrapped in 1934. The Y1 class would be gone by 1924 due to its high maintenance costs, but the Norfolk and Western saw enough virtue in the design to develop it further with the arrival of the Y2 class in 1918. If the Y1 class can lay claim to a truly enduring legacy, it is this. It's directly responsible for the spawning of the Norfolk and Western Z-Class 2662s. In 1911, the Norfolk and Western borrowed a Chesapeake and Ohio H2 Class 2662 to see how it would perform against one of its own Y1 Class 2882s. A Norfolk and Western employee that was involved in the trial claimed the H2 ran circles around the Y1. This apparently sent the Norfolk and Western to Alco, the manufacturer of the H2, and an order was placed for 150 copies of the Chesapeake and Ohio locomotive, and hence the Z1 class was born in 1912. The Z1 class and its variants would outlive the Y1 class by 34 years, with the last Z1 being retired in 1958. By 1918, the Roanoke shops had designed and built the first 5 locomotives of the Y2 class, and Baldwin would deliver 20 more by the end of 1919. The Y2s were significantly heavier than the Y1s, with the weight on the drive wheels increasing by 112,000 pounds. Boiler pressure saw a healthy increase to 230 pounds per square inch, and the Walschaerts valve gear had given way to Baker valve gear. The Roanoke-built machines featured 14-inch piston valves on the rear and 17-inch piston valves up front. The Baldwin products used 14-inch valves both front and rear. Unlike the Y1 and X1 classes, the Y2 class came equipped with a superheater. Driver diameter and cylinder dimensions were carried over from the Y1s, but fortunately, Baldwin's separable boiler was nowhere to be found. A larger 12,000-gallon capacity tender and a mechanical stoker rounded out the improvements over the Y1 class. In 1923, Roanoke would turn out 6 more locomotives of the Y2 design. With the high-pressure cylinder diameter increased to 25 inches and boiler pressure bumped up to 240 psi, this second batch would become the Y2A class. The main and side rods, crossheads, and crosshead guides were also revised for greater reliability. By 1923, the 25 members of the Y2 class would receive these upgrades along with an 18,000-gallon capacity tender and reclassed as Y2As as well. Of the 31 locomotives that ended up in the Y2A class, one would receive an unusual modification. In 1927, number 1702 would have Franklin reversible boosters installed in both tender trucks. These boosters powered both axles through a side rod and provided an additional 33,900 pounds of tractive effort. The next iteration of the Y class came from an unexpected source, the United States government. With the U.S. entry into World War I, the United States Railroad Administration, or USRA, was created to not only run the nation's railroads as one monolithic system, but also standardize the design of locomotives authorized to be manufactured during the war. 6 wheel configurations were chosen, and a heavy and light version of each was developed. For an in-depth look at the USRA, check out the United States Railroad Administration video in the USRA playlist. Right from the beginning, the USRA always chose a design basis for its standard locomotives that had proven itself successful in actual service. And while changes were made, none of them were to address a major design flaw. When it came to the 2882, the USRA took a slightly different approach. Thanks to Norfolk and Western mechanical engineer John Pilcher, the Y2 design came under the eye of the USRA design team. The Y2 class had been in service for less than a year and had already developed a reputation for being anemic. A firebox that was too small, coupled to a boiler that left some room for improvement, made the Y2s poor steamers. The USRA saw potential in the Y2 and set out to correct its shortcomings. While grade area remained the same, the firebox itself was enlarged, adding an additional 29 square feet of evaporative surface area. The overall dimensions of the boiler and diameter of the boiler flues were unchanged, but the number of flues was increased from 244 to 285. These changes added nearly 500 square feet of evaporative surface area and overcame the poor steaming issue. The resulting USRA 2882 rode on 57-inch drivers, and boiler pressure was increased to 270 psi. The high-pressure cylinders saw a modest increase to a 25-inch bore, and the low-pressure cylinders remained at 39 inches. But the most substantial increase came in tractive effort. The USRA Heavy developed just over 114,000 pounds of tractive effort compared to 96,000 pounds for the Y2. Of the 80 USRA 2882s produced, the Norfolk and Western received the lion's share of 50, which became the Y3 class. 45 came from Alco's Schenectady Works and 5 from Baldwin. Of the remaining 30, 20 went to the Virginian and 10 to the Clinchfield. The feedback received by the USRA on the 2882 followed the same pattern as that on other USRA types. The Norfolk and Western seemed pleased with the USRA design by stating it gave good performance. The only complaint was the gauge cocks and water level glasses gave false readings of boiler water level if the locomotive was parked on an incline. In 1923, the Norfolk and Western would order 30 copies of the USRA 2882 that would become the Y3A class. These were similar to the Y3 class. The only major difference was a larger tender. Over time, the Y3 class would receive Worthington feedwater heaters and boilers with large superheaters. One member of the class, number 2006, would have a Bethlehem-type booster installed in both tender trucks in 1927. These were similar to the Franklin types in that a side rod was used to transmit power to both axles. The Bethlehem boosters made an additional 34,500 pounds of starting tractive effort. The Y3 and Y3A classes would enjoy a nearly 40-year service life, although not entirely on the Norfolk and Western. During World War II, many railroads were having difficulty obtaining the heavy freight power they needed due to wartime restrictions. By 1942, members of the Y6 class had entered service on the Norfolk and Western, making the Y3s surplus. The Norfolk and Western would end up selling 19 Y3s to other roads during the war. The Santa Fe purchased 8 for helper service in New Mexico, and after the war, the Santa Fe scrapped 1 and sold the remaining 7 to the Virginian Railroad. They would serve on the Virginian until being retired in 1955. The Pennsylvania Railroad bought 6 and put them to work on drag freights between Hagerstown, Maryland, and Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. After the war, they were used in the Columbus, Ohio area until being scrapped in 1947. And finally, the Union Pacific bought 5 in 1945 and operated them for 2 years before also scrapping them in 1947. One member of the Y3 class survives today. Y3 number 2050 was sold for scrap to Armco Steel Corporation in 1959. Number 2050 was used for a time as a stationary boiler, but instead of being scrapped, it was donated to the Illinois Railway Museum in 1975. In 1927, another 10 would arrive from Alco's Richmond Works. This batch was originally classed as Y3B, but would later be reclassed as Y4. This batch was the heaviest to date with over 500,000 pounds of adhesive weight. Boiler pressure was originally set at 230 psi, but was later increased to 270, along with Worthington feedwater heaters being installed. The Y3B Y4 class was also the first class of the Y series to have a combustion chamber ahead of the firebox. At 230 pounds boiler pressure, tractive effort was 101,400 pounds. That figure jumped to 114,000 pounds at 270 psi. When running in simple mode, tractive effort took a massive leap to just shy of 137,000 pounds. Driver diameter and cylinder dimensions were carried over from the Y3 class, but tender capacity was increased to 24,000 gallons of water and 27 tons of coal. The Y4 class also holds the distinction of being the last steam locomotives the N&W would buy from a commercial builder. The year 1930 saw the arrival of the Y4A class. The 20 members of the class were built by the Norfolk and Western Roanoke shops and were the first of the Y series to have a 300 psi boiler pressure. They were also the first to have the prominent inverted Y pipe connecting the valve chambers on the front engine, and the last to ride on built-up engine frames. The enormous power developed by the Y4As convinced the Norfolk and Western that the fabricated engine frame had met its match. These frames had a tendency to loosen up or come unglued, but in 1940 the Y4As were rebuilt on cast steel frames, receiving roller bearings on the driven axles and reclassed as the Y5 class. Once again, cylinder and driver diameter remained unchanged from the Y4s, but tractive effort was another story. Perhaps a foreshadowing of pulled drawbars and shattered knuckles becoming a thing on the Norfolk and Western, tractive effort in compound mode came in at 126,800 pounds. In simple mode, that figure rose to a mind-boggling 152,200 pounds. While the Y5s performed well and would go on to serve on the Norfolk and Western until the end of steam, the road wasn't done tinkering with the Y class. In 1936, the first 5 members of the Y6 class began to roll out of Roanoke shops. This class was nearly identical to the Y5s in terms of overall performance, but there were some significant changes. The Y6s were the first to ride on cast steel frames with integrally cast cylinders. This class also featured Timken roller bearings on all axles and McGill multi-roll bearings on the valve gear. Worthington BL-type feedwater heaters and piston valves 18 inches in diameter rounded out the changes over the Y5 class. By October 1940, 30 more would arrive, bringing the Y6 class to 35 locomotives in total. In 1942, Roanoke would turn out 16 more that would become the Y6A class. The Y6As only differed in minor details, but their arrival brought the total number of locomotives built for the entire Y class to date to over 200. In 1948, Roanoke began turning out the first members of the Y6B class. Even though the Y6B would end up being the end of the line for the Y class, the improvements kept coming. The first 17 Y6Bs incorporated all of the improvements found on the Y6s. However, the Worthington BL feedwater heater had given way to the Worthington SA type, and driver diameter was increased to 58 inches. The final 13 would roll out of Roanoke between August of 1950 and April of 1952. The Y6B was equipped with what was termed variable valve plumbing, an arrangement that sent tractive effort to insane levels but was almost too much of a good thing. An improved intercepting and reducing valve allowed the Y6B to operate in simple mode. While developing 170,000 pounds of tractive effort, the front engine would often lose its footing. To increase adhesive weight, 29,000 pounds of lead were poured into the cavities inside the front engine frame. Even with the extra weight, the front engine's adhesion factor was still a rather slippery 3.6. The upside was the Y6B could be simpled at any speed, not just on starting. The downside, however, was the front engine produced so much power in simple mode that it really pushed the limits of what a cast steel frame could handle. The Y6B also featured a unique type of booster. Typically, a booster is a small steam engine mounted in a locomotive's trailing truck or in one or both tender trucks. The Y6B had a booster valve that would emit small quantities of boiler pressure steam into the front cylinders. This would give the front engine a power boost without going to full simple mode. These improvements would find their way into the Y6 and Y6A classes, as well as a few Y5s when they came due for a major shopping. All told, the Y6B could develop 132,000 pounds of tractive effort in compound mode and 170,000 pounds in simple. While pulling a load of 13,500 tons, the Y6B could develop 5,600 horsepower at 25 miles per hour and capable of a top speed of 50 miles per hour. When we also consider the Y6B's axle loading, overall dimensions, economy of operation, practical speeds, and sheer pulling power, the Y6B rates as the most successful compound articulated ever built. Arriving rather late in the steam era, the Y6B held the line against the diesel onslaught through the 1950s. The last Y6B to run in regular revenue service was number 2190 in May of 1960. Unfortunately, all 30 Y6Bs would meet with the scrapper's torch. But one member of the Y6 class has been preserved. Y6A number 2156 can be seen on static display at the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri.